Joining me now is the co-host of the Christopher and Rajay Show, Christopher Glenon.
Thank you very much for having me on again, Tom.
Hey, thanks for joining me. So, environmental social governance, ESG, it's called woke capitalism, but what is it really?
So it is woke capitalism on some level. What you have is a requirement, or at least a rule that allows fund investors to look at the funds that they have, and it's ESG versus non-ESG. So like you said, the environmental, social, and governance side of it, or funds that don't necessarily play in that field. So when you look at it, I'm a financial advisor. I have a fiduciary duty, a legal responsibility to the people that I represent to make sure they're getting the maximum return on their investment. So back in 2020, Trump had taken away the ability for them to consider the ESG kind of things, because what you saw was a rapid rise in the trajectory of ESG funding and funds that were creating funds for ESG. And some of them were doing what's called greenwashing. So they're not necessarily ESG companies, but so that they could get investor money, they began classifying as ESG. So you have a lot of fraud in that area. You had a trajectory that was ramping up really high, really fast. And when you have those kind of things, you're creating some kind of bubble, or at least some kind of new floor that may not be stable enough. So when you're investing in that and you keep pouring money in that, there's going to be a pullback, and that pullback is what's going to hurt investors. If you're a long-term investor and you're looking at your 401k and you're watching the growth of that, you could be hurt. If you're beginning to approach your retirement, you could be hurt severely, because if you're retiring in 2 to 5 years and those funds pull back, all of a sudden your 401k is destroyed, just as you're going into retirement. So woke capitalism looks at ESG, looks at what are your environmental causes, what are your social causes, Black Lives Matter, companies that are adhering to certain policies like Exxon or whatever for trying to leave. We talked about environmental footprint before. Mm-hmm. So to leave a clean environmental footprint. Climate change is one of the big things that they try to incorporate into that with the environmental side of it. So as you know, I don't like the climate change approach, because I think that's working from a position of fear, and I like a position of strength, one where we look and say, hey, let's be accountable and responsible.
Now, you mentioned something like so-called climate change. My first part of my question would be, are the effects of these decisions being measured in any meaningful way? And you had mentioned some of the Trump administration's reaction to ESG. How is the Biden administration treating ESG funds?
So the Biden administration, during their recent ESG rollout, they basically decided they wanted to enable and encourage those with the fiduciary duty of investing the funds to be able to look at ESG causes. So they were able to look at environmental causes and social causes and take that into account for some of the risk and return. When you're in that position, you're trying to get high returns for your investors, especially when you're trying to grow their funds and grow their retirements. So when you look at ESG, another thing that I saw in case study after case study is they are higher risk, but they're also lower return because there are higher maintenance fees. The maintenance fees on ESG type funds is about 3 times that of what it is for a non-ESG fund. So it's about 0.12% for a non-ESG, and it's 0.34% for an ESG fund. So you're literally looking at 3 times the cost. So it begins to eat away at the client's retirement funding. So.
And that's not looking out for your investor. So this doesn't seem like it's market-driven. It seems like it's policy-driven. So my question would be, is this creating a sort of artificial bubble? And do investors, maybe somebody with a retirement fund, do they have funds in ESG that they're not even aware is in ESG?
I think I haven't looked deep enough into that to see if they have funds that aren't aware, but I'm sure that if you're putting your 401k into something and someone's using ESG, I know I have a 401k, I don't always look at all the things. I look at the time horizons, 2040 fund, 2050 fund, 2060 fund, etc. So I may not look at all of the mixes that they have in there, and they could have a substantial amount of my 401k in there, and I wouldn't necessarily have paid enough attention to that. And as the average investor, I would say that most of them are probably not. They're just putting their money into their 401k. So there's a lot of risk involved with that. Now, the Biden administration is not requiring a certain percentage of that, but it does enable the funds to go out and try to more directly invest more heavily in those kind of ESG things if they see that, if they can justify. Actually, that's the other thing we should talk about is justification. If I'm a financial advisor and I can justify it in some way by writing down, hey, this is why I think, and you somehow include climate change, and then you say, oh, well, because we're doing this on climate change, we're going to see this benefit. Mm-hmm. Well, the real problem with that is companies that do invest in things like climate change or social causes, sometimes it hits their bottom line harder because they are having more expenses associated with that. It becomes more expensive to be environmentally friendly. That's why companies have to balance how environmentally friendly they are, how much they impact the environment. So there are a lot of different ways that you can wind up impacting the investor on these things.
Yeah, I've also noticed on the social aspect, we've seen companies like Bud Light, Target, Disney, all sort of go into the social aspect that's hurting their bottom line that they keep doubling down, which confuses a consumer like myself. So my last question is, there's a lot of corners of the internet that believe this is sort of a wider movement. Do you find any credence to that?
I have seen, as I mentioned, as Trump came into office, or as Trump was writing up his rule, which he had already been in office by 4 years at that point, but as he wrote up his rule, he saw the trajectory was rising. And so the regulators behind him said, hey, we need to kind of put some clamps on this and let people figure out what is ESG? Let's get some metrics around that. Let's get some real data around that. Let's get some criteria so we can genuinely classify them as ESG as opposed to greenwashing and allowing companies to come in and say they're ESG. I could say I'm ESG all day long and incentivize you to invest in me because you believe in my cause, my quote unquote cause. But the reality is I don't have to necessarily do that. I can just say it and use it as a marketing ploy to pry dollars from you. And there are a lot of unethical businesses out there that will push their agendas in that manner. So, or generate more revenue for them.
Yeah, and very unfortunately, I think that as long as this administration is in power, we're going to continue seeing a ramping up of ESG. I think when we were talking before this, you had mentioned that the stat of this year is even radically different than 2025, let's say.
Correct. I looked, and from a global scale, there's about $35 trillion in ESG funds around the globe. That's projected by Bloomberg Intelligence to grow to $50 trillion by 2025. So you're looking at another $15 trillion, which is almost 40%, I think is about what that number comes out to. So you're looking at a 40% increase between now and 2025.
And something tells me it's going to get a lot larger by 2030. Anyway, though, Christopher Glenon, thank you so much for joining me on One America News.
Thank you very much for having me, Tom.